All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Allen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's authors talk, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's Authors Talk, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Major General Jason Baum of the United States Marine Corps discussing his recent book, Washington's Marines, The Origins of the Corps and the American Revolution, 1775 to 1777. That was published by Savas Beatty. In the early days of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress rushed to form an army, but soon realized that to win its freedom, America would need men who could fight on both land and sea. Enter the Marines. As Washington struggled to preserve his command after defeats in New York and New Jersey in 1776, the nascent U.S. Navy and Marines deployed the first American fleet, conducted their first amphibious operations, and waged war on the rivers and seas to block British reinforcements and capture critically needed supplies. Desperate times forced Congress to detach Continental Marines from the Navy to join the embattled army as Washington sought an important stroke to defeat his adversary. Drawing on his research and primary sources, as well as his own military knowledge and experiences, tonight General Baum will examine the Marine Corps' humble beginnings and what it achieved during the early years of the American Revolution. General Baum is a Marine with more than 30 years of service. An infantryman by trade, he has commanded at every level from platoon commander to commanding general in peacetime and war. He has also served in key staff positions, including as a strategic planner with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Director of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School, House Director of the Marine Corps Office of Legislative Affairs, and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Naval Striking and Support Forces for NATO. He holds a bachelor's degree in marketing and master's degrees in military studies and national security studies. Additionally, he has written several articles for the Marine Corps Gazette and another book, From Cold War to ISIL, One Marine's Journey, published in 2019 by the Naval Institute Press. But before I turn things over to General Baum, the usual housekeeping items are in order for our friends joining us on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's authors talk, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for General Baum at any point during the presentation, and you can do that by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you as always. So without further delay, and all of that, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House Major General Jason Baum.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And just let me tell you how motivated I am to be here tonight. You know, what a pleasure it was for me to come in and start to meet some of you and just hear the stories of your own service and your own love for history. Absolute honor for me to be here in this really beautiful facility. I particularly want to thank Andrew Allen for the kind invitation for bringing me here this evening to be able to share a little bit of Washington's Marines, the origins of our United States Marine Corps. And thank you for the service of many of the Marines in the room as well. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you. Aim high, sir, you know. All right, so I'll tell you a quick sea story, right? My wife is an Air Force brat. Her dad was a B-52 navigator. I knew I had arrived when she finally started placing the Marine Corps over the Air Force, all right? It eventually happened, so Yeah, thank you for your service, for all the veterans out there. And oh, by the way, for any spouses out there or family members too, you serve just as much and more so in many cases. So thank you. And so I understand we have about an hour's time. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and I'm really interested to hear what questions you may have. So you ready to jump in? Okay. I think many of you are familiar with this photo and also are familiar with the honorable service, the selfless sacrifice, and the war-fighting prowess of today's United States Marines. But very few know about the Corps' humble beginnings and how, like our brothers in the Continental Army, Navy, state and militia groups, and privateers, contributed to the winning of our nation's independence and the preservation of our freedoms. The roots of the American Revolution can be traced back to the French and Indian War from 1756 to 63, in which England, France, and Spain vied for control of the North American continent. Although the British and Americans prevailed, this victory and providing for the enduring defense of America came at a high cost. The mother country thought it was only right that the colonists bear their fair share of the cost, particularly since Americans were only paying 1/20th of the taxes of those back in England. But the independently minded Americans pushed back on several imposed taxes, particularly when levied without proper representation in the government. Although neither country sought it, a war and conflict was inevitable. On April 19, 1775, Captain John Parker formed a company of Minutemen on the Lexington Green to face off against 700 British soldiers and Marines. Before the day was done, the Americans had placed the British in Boston under siege. But this victory on land was only half of the equation, because America is a maritime nation with extensive coastlines and countless lakes, rivers, and canals that can be used to quickly move people and things. Americans would need men who could fight on the land as well as the sea in order to defeat one of the world's most powerful nations. This became evident in mid-June of 1775 during an event that author James Fenimore Cooper referred to as the Lexington of the Sea. Principal British supplies and reinforcements had to be transported 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. This proved to be timely, expensive, and dangerous. So British leadership sought closer, more local solutions in the form of using the West Indies, the Southern colonies, and the area between Boston and Nova Scotia that would become the state of Maine in 1820, but back then was all part of the Massachusetts Providence. British Admiral Graves sent 2 merchant vessels loaded with flour and other food supplies, guarded by the armed schooner Margaretta, to the area that I just described, and specifically the town of Machias, to trade for lumber and other supplies needed in Boston. Local patriots captured the 2 merchant ships, but the Margaretta escaped. The Americans grabbed pitchforks and muskets, boarded the 2 merchantmen, and gave chase, that you see depicted here in the middle photo. The resultant Battle of Machias, or what some refer to as the Battle of the Margaretta, resulted in an American victory in what became the first naval engagement of the American Revolution. 4 days later, Colonel William Prescott led approximately 1,600 Americans up Breeds Hill, not Bunkers Hill, Breeds Hill, on the Charleston Peninsula, resulting in a British victory, but at a very high cost, as you see depicted in the bottom photo. 3 days later, General George Washington assumed command of the Continental Army outside of Boston. The immediacy of the crisis in Boston focused the Continental Congress efforts on establishing the Army first, but it would soon need to address the need for a Navy and Marines. Not possessing either at the time, Congress leveraged a temporary stopgap in the use of privateers, or sanctioned pirates, in which private merchantmen were converted into warships and manned by civilian crews to capture British shipping on the high seas. Privateers had some positive impact on capturing British supplies, but many were in the business of personal gain. Their actions were rarely coordinated with the ground forces, and George Washington had no control over them. In fact, they became a draw on manpower and other resources needed by the Army, Navy, and Marines later in the war. Washington quickly realized that the privateers alone were insufficient to blockade the British in Boston, being resupplied and reinforced. So out of necessity, he created his own Navy, using soldiers to fill the role of sailors and Marines. Colonel John Glover from Marblehead, Massachusetts, provided Washington with his first ship named Hannah, seen depicted here, named after John Glover's wife. Washington's Navy soon grew to 6 ships, and although they had some early successes, the challenges associated with building a pickup team like this soon came to the forefront. In fact, one of Washington's agents described the situation this way. He said, "The people on board the brigantine Washington are in general discontent and have agreed to do no duty on board said vessels and say that they enlisted to serve in the Army as soldiers and not as Marines." Benedict Arnold had a similar experience a year later when he assigned soldiers to serve on his freshwater fleet on Lake Champlain to fight the Battle of Balcour Island. The British won that battle, but as you know, had to go back up into Canada because it was too late in the fighting season. So although it was a tactical defeat, it was a strategic victory, but Arnold too was disappointed in his pickup team that he had to build using soldiers to serve as Marines. He's quoted as saying, "We have a wretched motley crew, the Marines, the refuse of every regiment, and the seamen, few of them ever wet with salt water." Recognizing these challenges, Congress was forced to act when it received an intelligence report on the 5th of October, 1775, that 2 unprotected British merchant ships were on their way to Quebec loaded with arms and ammunition. Congress assigned a committee of 3 consisting of John Adams from Massachusetts, Silas Deane from Connecticut, and John Langdon from New Hampshire to address the issue. They devised a plan to have Washington secure 2 armed vessels from the New England colonies for use to capture the British ships. The full Congress approved this plan on the 13th of October, 1775, making this the official birthday of the United States Navy. Washington had difficulty finding the ships in New England, though, because they were all being used as privateers. So he recommended to the Congress that they look further south. So 5 merchant vessels were purchased and converted into warships in Philadelphia. So the Navy had its first fleet, but now it needed an admiral to command it. It selected the gentleman you see in the upper left. 57-year-old Essex Hopkins was a sea captain from Providence, Rhode Island, and he also served as a privateer captain during the French and Indian War. Hopkins established the largest of the 5 merchant vessels, the Alfred that you see depicted here, as his flagship, and assigned a young officer named John Paul Jones as the ship's first lieutenant. As the first fleet prepared to sail in January of 1776, it raised 2 flags on board the Alfred. Congress approved the Grand Union flag as the official flag of the United Colonies on the 3rd of December, 1775. And Congressman Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina and a member of the newly formed Marine Committee presented John Paul Jones with the flag of his own design, the Gadsden flag that you see on the lower left, on the 20th of December, 75. But now we need our Marines. Although Congress had established a Navy, it failed to establish the Marines at first to serve beside it until another fateful event occurred that forced their hand. On November 2nd, 1775, the citizens of Passamaquoddy, Canada, up in Nova Scotia, fueled American hopes of Canada joining the struggle against England as a 14th American colony. When the Committee of Safety from Passamaquoddy petitioned Congress to allow its admission into, quote, the Association of North Americans for the preservation of their rights and freedoms, Congress responded by commissioning the first Continental Marine officer 3 days later. November 5th, Samuel Nicholas, the gentleman you see here, became the first and therefore the senior ranking Marine officer when President of the Continental Congress, John Hancock, signed his commission. Many mistakenly point to Samuel Nicholas as being the first commandant of the Marine Corps, but that is incorrect because Congress did not bestow that title on the commandant until 1798, well after the Revolutionary War ended. 31-year-old Nicholas was a prominent figure in Philadelphia. He was born a Quaker and his father died when he was 7. He attended the Academy of Philadelphia, which later became the University of Pennsylvania, graduated at the age of 16, after which he became a merchant and owner of the Conestoga Wagon Tavern in downtown Philadelphia, starting a trend of Marines being affiliated with alcohol. That still holds true today, and you Marines in the audience know what I'm talking about. Nicholas would honorably serve as a senior Marine throughout the war from 1775 all the way to 1783. Being the first Marine, he also became the first Marine recruiter. Following a note from Passamaquoddy, Congress energized the Marine Committee, now renamed, to increase to 5 members by adding John Jay from New York and Stephen Hopkins from Rhode Island. They were tasked with developing options for conducting a naval campaign to Nova Scotia to capture the principal Royal Navy base in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So on Passamaquoddy's advice, Congress developed this plan, and it was developed by the Committee of 5 in the upper floor of this building you see before you, Tun Tavern, which, yes, is another bar in downtown Philadelphia. And it is for that reason that Tun Tavern is commonly understood to be the birthplace of the Marine Corps. Yes, we were born in a bar. Congress further directed, the committee presented its recommendation to the full Congress on the 9th of November. And the following day, Congress resolved, quote, that 2 battalions of Marines be raised, that they be distinguished by the names of the 1st and 2nd Battalion of American Marines, making 10 November the official birthday of the United States Marine Corps that is still celebrated by Marines across the world every year. Congress directed George Washington to cherry pick able-bodied seamen from the Army's ranks in order to become Marines and fill the 2 battalions of Marines. But Washington was already shorthanded outside of Boston, and he balked at the plan of reducing the strength of his army because, again, he was trying to hold the British under siege. He also identified to John Hancock that there was no way that he can conduct a naval campaign to capture the base at Halifax at the time. John Hancock acquiesced, but determined to still form a body of Marines to serve with the fleet. So Congress directed Samuel Nicholas and other Marine officers it had commissioned at the time to recruit their own men, principally from the Philadelphia area. Congress chose to organize the Marines in such a way that they could easily transition for service at sea to operations ashore by planning to establish 10 separate companies of 50 Marines each. Each company of 50 would serve as the Marine detachment on board its own ship and could be consolidated with other Marine detachments to form landing parties to conduct operations ashore if required. Nicholas led the efforts to recruit 5 companies to man the fleet's first 5 ships, and he took personal command of the Marine detachment on board the flagship Alfred, serving side by side with John Paul Jones. A snapshot of Lieutenant Isaac Craig's Marine detachment from the ship Andrew Doria will provide a very good profile of what a Continental Marine company looked like in 1775. Craig's company consisted of 40 Marines, few of which were born in America. They were mostly immigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, Holland, Switzerland, and Germany. All but one of them was recruited from Philadelphia. Their average age was 25 and a half years old, with the youngest being 18 and the oldest being 40. Average height was 5'6", with the shortest being 5'3.5" and the tallest being 6 foot tall. The Marines brought many skills to their organization. They were carpenters, masons, barbers, bakers, cabinet makers, coopers, jewelers, brass founders, tailors, butchers, painters, weavers, wool combers, millers, laborers, servants, and a single doctor. The American fleet set sail on its inaugural cruise on January 4th, 1776. In all, the fleet consisted by then of 7 ships armed with 110 cannons, manned by 680 sailors and 234 Marines. Admiral Hopkins had 2 sets of orders on the flagship Alfred once he put to sea. The first described the conduct expected of officers and men. The second set of orders identified several ambitious and, quite frankly, unrealistic tasks. Hopkins was to immediately set course for the Chesapeake Bay, where he was to locate, capture, and destroy the British fleet located there. Once that was complete, he was supposed to continue on to the Carolinas, where he was to locate, capture, and destroy the British fleet located there. And if that was not enough, once that was complete, he was to push back north, go to Rhode Island, and locate, capture, and destroy the British fleet there, with 5 converted merchant ships on their first cruise. However, the orders also included a caveat that Hopkins chose to exploit. It stated, quote, "If bad winds or stormy weather or any other unforeseen accident or disaster disabled you so to do, you are then to follow such course as your best judgment shall suggest." Hopkins wisely chose to use his better judgment and determined to follow his own path. He had earlier received an intelligence report that there was gunpowder and cannons needed by George Washington's army outside of Boston being stored in New Providence, Bahamas. New Providence was once heavily defended. It consisted of 2 main forts, Fort Matangau, which is located to protect the eastern approaches to Nassau Harbor, while Fort Nassau covered the western approaches to Nassau Harbor. Events on the North American continent, though, had weakened the island defenses when its regiment of regular soldiers were sent to reinforce America. So the governor, Montford Brown, established a 300-man militia force and had 1 small schooner, the St. John, for protection. Admiral Hopkins tasked Captain Samuel Nicholas with capturing the forts with a landing force of 220 Marines and 50 sailors. Unfortunately, the fleet exposed itself early, and Brown had most of the gunpowder shipped to East Florida before the Marines landed. Regardless, the raid was a success, with the Marines capturing both forts with 88 cannons, 16 mortars, and an abundance of ordnance. Of note, this exceeds the number of guns transported by Henry Knox from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, which allowed the Washington and the Continental Army to force the British to evacuate Boston. Brown attempted to escape during the raid, and he was placed under house arrest and guarded by a company of Marines. He later complained that, quote, "The Marines used at discretion all my wines and other liquors, as they had done everything else they had occasion for." Hopkins loaded Brown and the prizes captured by the Marines on board his ships, and they departed for Rhode Island. Brown was later used in a prisoner exchange to secure the release of American General John Sullivan, who had been captured in the Battle of Long Island just prior to the operation, or as you were just after the operation. Strategically, the first amphibious operation conducted by the sailors and Marines achieved another important objective. It forced the British to employ their naval forces over a much broader area in order to protect their other holdings across the globe. As the fleet headed north, the British sent a force up the Delaware River to test American defenses protecting Philadelphia. This resulted in a second stage of recruitment of the Navy and Marines, which included a gentleman named Robert Mullen, who was the owner of Tun Tavern. It also included a young man named John Martin, who is also known as Cato, who was the first African-American Marine enlisted in April of 1776. Hopkins captured several British merchant ships on the way to Rhode Island, but he got in a tough fight against HMS Glasgow, a British frigate en route, resulting in the death of Marine Second Lieutenant John Fitzpatrick of Nicholas's Marine detachment on board the Alfred, making him the first Marine killed in combat during the American Revolution, and therefore the first Marine killed ever. On arriving in Rhode Island, Hopkins sent Nicholas back to Philadelphia with dispatches for the Congress. Congress promoted Nicholas from captain to major, and on his return, they assigned him to recruit 4 new detachments of ships for 4 of the 13 original frigates that they authorized to be constructed, 4 of which were being constructed in Philadelphia. And those were the Washington, the Delaware, the Effingham, and the Randolph. In the meantime, George Washington shifts his army from Boston to New York, where the challenges of not having a credible naval force once again played to his disadvantage. As you can see, Manhattan Island and Long Island are surrounded by water, and it is the water that provides you maneuver space to move people and things more quicker sometimes than those who are on the ground. By mid-August 76, the British had assembled an army of 32,000 troops, supported by a fleet of 10,000 sailors and 2,000 Royal Marines manning hundreds of vessels armed with 1,200 cannons. Washington had 19,000 green troops with no Navy or Marines. Like at Boston, he created his own ad hoc Navy in order to do what he could, but it accomplished very little against such a superior force. The outcome was predictable. The Army faced a string of defeats, starting with the Battle of Long Island in August. Washington achieved a small victory at the Battle of Harlem Heights in September, only to face defeat again in the Battle of White Plains in October. Arnold fought valiantly at Valcour Island up on Lake Champlain that same month before the Americans faced a devastating defeat at Fort Washington on New York Island. In November, followed by the loss of Fort Lee in New Jersey, that same month, Washington was chased all the way across New Jersey with General Howe in pursuit. This ended with the crossing of the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on the 8th of December. To make matters worse, General Grant had just captured Newport, Rhode Island that same month. These were dire times for the Continental forces. Disease, desertion, casualties, and terminating enlistments had dwindled the troops that were accompanying Washington from that 19,000 down to less than 2,500. Something needed to be done to change the tide of war. Washington knew he had to seize the initiative back from the British or the war would be lost, but he needed more troops. Enter Washington's Marines, which consisted really of 4 distinct groups. I already mentioned the soldier Marines, like John Glover, pictured here on the far left, but several privateers also served as Marines, like 27-year-old William Shippen, a merchant and father of 4 from Philadelphia, who started the war as a privateer before commanding a Marine detachment on board the Pennsylvania State Navy's flagship Montgomery. With the British and the Hessian forces now outside of Philadelphia and near his family's doorstep, Shippen went ashore to fight beside the Continental Marines as a member of a Philadelphia militia group known as the Associators. Unfortunately, Shippen would be killed in the Battle of Princeton in the coming weeks, making him the first state Marine to be killed in the war. The Pennsylvania Navy at the time consisted of 48 vessels of varying sizes, to include 2 floating batteries, the Arnold and the Putnam, each carrying 12 18-pound cannons and manned exclusively by Pennsylvania State Marines. The gentleman in the middle picture is 29-year-old Thomas Forrest. Forrest received a commission in the Pennsylvania Marines in March of 76. He commanded the Arnold, the floating battery, until transferred on October 5th to the Pennsylvania State Artillery to command a company. Forrest would play key roles in the upcoming battles. We'll talk about him a little bit more. This gentleman on the right is Andrew Porter. He was a schoolmaster in Philadelphia when he received his commission as a Continental Marine officer. Many of his Marines were reportedly former or current students of Porter's. Porter commanded the Marine detachment on board the frigate Effingham and would fight as a company commander under Samuel Nicholas in the coming battles. One interesting side story on Porter. He would later resign his Marine commission in order to accept a commission as an Army artillery officer. And while doing so, one of his colleagues, an Army major named Eustace, commented, quote, "He is nothing but a damn schoolmaster." Porter responded, "I have been a schoolmaster, sir, and I have not forgotten my vocation," at which time he pulled his sword out and struck Eustace in the back with the blunt end of the sword, signifying him calling him out to a duel. So the two gentlemen meet at the corners of 9th and Arch Street in downtown Philadelphia. Porter pulls out his musket and bam, shoots Eustace right through the heart, killing him on the spot. He was court-martialed for that murder and then later exonerated, promoted to major, and then given the position of the vacancy from Eustace, the gentleman he just killed. True story. So Nicholas received orders from Congress to consolidate the Marine detachments from those frigates being built in Philadelphia to form a battalion of Marines to join George Washington at this most dire time. Nicholas's battalion consisted of between 120 and 130 Marines. He left one Marine detachment under Captain Samuel Shaw and his Marines on the Randolph back in Philadelphia because that ship was nearing completion and they wanted to get it to sea before the British would block the Delaware River. In all, 500 to 600 Continental and State Marines and sailors operated ashore, and as many as 700 more operated on the Delaware River during this time, comprising nearly a quarter of George Washington's total force, all of who participated in what would become known as the 10 Crucial Days, which we'll describe here in a moment. Before arriving at the Delaware River, Washington had the foresight to collect all the boats upriver for 70 miles from Philadelphia. General Howe, leading the British, made a feeble attempt to find boats on his arrival at the river, and finding none, decided to place his troops into winter quarters on December 14, 1776. In order to house and feed the troops while supposedly protecting loyalist eastern New Jersey, Howe spread the force across 17 isolated cantonments. The area closest to the Americans was controlled by German Hessians that had been hired to fight for the British. The senior officer in the area was Karl von Donop, who housed his troops with him in the Burlington and Bordertown area that you see in the center of the map located on the left. Colonel Johann Rahl commanded the brigade in the Trenton Crosswicks area, which you see in the upper center portion of the map. As the Hessians settled into their winter quarters, Washington began to gather what forces he could, while seeking intelligence to plan an important stroke against the enemy. Washington developed a plan consisting of one main effort and 3 supporting efforts to try and capture the British throughout the area, and the Hessians specifically located in Trenton. He would personally command the main effort consisting of 2,400 troops that would cross the Delaware River up in an area called McConkey's Ferry and march 9 miles to strike Rahl in the flank and from the north at Trenton. Support in Effort 1 consisted of Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia forces that were supposed to cross the Delaware just south of Trenton and capture a key bridge across an area called Assunpink Creek that would block Hessians from escaping as Washington attacked from the opposite side. The Continental Marines worked very closely with the Philadelphia Associators, and they were located down here in the Bristol area. Their mission was to cross the river and then block Colonel von Donop and his forces from being able to reinforce Rahl as Washington attacked with the main effort. And the final supporting effort was down here where General Putnam sent some militia over across the river from Philadelphia to further hold any British or Hessian forces down in this area to prevent them from impacting the battle around Trenton. Unfortunately, Washington's force was the only one to successfully cross the Delaware River on Christmas Day, 1776. Ewan and Dickinson, who led the New Jersey and Pennsylvania militia, faced river conditions like you see here in the lower right-hand picture. That's actually the Delaware River with the ice blocking any access. Boats could not be pushed across the river, nor could they walk across because the ice was so treacherous and they would fall through and be ineffective. The Associators and the Marines down in Bristol actually got 2/3 of their force across the river, but there was a nor'easter that rolled in, and the blizzard conditions that existed made it so that the rest of the crossing was untenable. The ice was starting to form on the shoreline. They tried to land their artillery, their cannons, but they were unable to do so. So the overall commander down there was a guy named John Cadwalder, in charge of the Associated Brigade, made the call to pull everyone back across the Pennsylvania side. He didn't think anyone was able to cross the river successfully that night. And Putnam faced similar issues down south. Due to the severe weather, Cadwalder again believed that none of the forces had made it across the river and was in the process of writing to George Washington the next morning when he heard cannon fire off in the distance towards Trenton. And then he saw fleeing Hessians on the New Jersey side of the river moving in a hasty way. He decided to recross the river the next morning, now understanding and getting the word that Washington was actually successful in crossing the previous day. Unfortunately, as the Associators and the Marines successfully crossed the Delaware on the 26th of December, they were only then to find out that George Washington had recrossed back into Pennsylvania. And that was communications at the time and the challenges of command and control. So Cadwalder began to waffle, and he planned to abort the mission once more, but the Marines and the soldiers that were with him were not having any of it. They were like, we are not crossing this river again. So they convinced Cadwalder to stay on their side of the river and be able to try and take Dunlop's forces, who are now retreating towards Princeton, in pursuit. Von Dunlop raced back towards Princeton, where General Grant was stationed with the 4th Brigade. He lost about 50 stragglers to Cadwalder and the Continental Marines as they raced to try and capture them before they got to Princeton. Cadwalder wrote back to Washington, recommending that he now recross the river back into New Jersey and then commence security and intelligence gathering patrols, of which the Continental Marines were active participants. In fact, Samuel Nicholas requested permission to go to Monmouth, if you all know about the famous battle at Monmouth later in the war, because the sheriff of Monmouth was known to be holding patriots prisoner because they refused to remain loyal to the king. Cadwalder denied Nicholas's request, though, because he knew that Washington was getting ready to recross the river. Washington recrossed the Delaware at the end of December and was able to consolidate approximately 6,000 troops outside Trenton to include the Continental Marines. But the Americans were not the only ones preparing for a fight. Lord Cornwallis was directed by General Howe to assume overall command of approximately 10,000 British and Hessian forces now located at Princeton, and to attack and finally defeat the rebels. Understanding that strength lies in the defense and that he was outnumbered, Washington established a strong position along Assunpink Creek on the south side of Trenton. He focused his defense on key crossing sites, with the principal location being the bridge that the Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia was supposed to capture in that initial attack. Washington sent a force, including that state Marine, Thomas Forrest, forward with his artillery, and Edward Hand's riflemen to conduct a delay-in action from Princeton to delay Howe and Cornwallis as they attacked south towards George Washington. That bought the Continentals enough time to consolidate their forces and establish their defensive positions south along the river. The British sustained upwards of 500 casualties during this critical time. Cornwallis and the British and Hessian forces focused their attacks on the bridge once they made it to Trenton. 3 separate times they tried to cross the bridge, and 3 separate times they were repulsed. After the initial attack, George Washington understood that he may lose this battle. So initially, he had the Continental Marines and the Associators located on the right flank, but after the first attack, pulled them in to reinforce that primary crossing site where the British were focusing their main effort. And they successfully repulsed the British. Of note, Cadwalader had earlier employed spies throughout the area to determine British dispositions, and he provided George Washington with this hand-drawn map of Princeton and where the British forces were located. That will come in handy here in just a moment. The British pulled back to lick their wounds after their 3rd failed attempt attacking across the bridge. Darkness fell, and once it settled in, Cornwallis did not want to attack a fortified position on unfamiliar ground in the darkness. He called for reinforcements from Maidenhead, just north of Trenton, and also the remnants of the 4th Brigade that were currently located in Princeton. And what he stated is, we will bag the fox in the morning once those reinforcements arrived. But not all of Cornwallis' staff believed that the Americans would remain in their current position with their backs to the Delaware River and an overwhelming force to their front. And they were right. Using deception and guise that evening, Washington had a force of 500 soldiers continue to stoke the campfires and make a lot of noise, replicating that of the entire army. When those soldiers remained behind doing that, he quietly pulled out the rest of the forces to include the Continental Marines, now moving as part of General Greene's division, and they moved north along a circulus route in order to attack Princeton from the flank the next morning. Throughout the night of 2nd of January, 1777, Washington led his force 11 miles further north along the little-known road called Quaker Road. He intended to attack Princeton using the map that Cadwalader had previously provided him to develop his plan. The general's plan for Princeton was to send General Greene along the Stony Brook in order to capture a bridge here at Mill Pond to be able to block Cornwallis from coming back up from Trenton to then reinforce the remnants of those forces left in Princeton. He would then attack with the main effort along a hidden road and hit Princeton from the flank. Just as the sun was rising on the 3rd of January, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, who was in charge of the British, was leading a force of 700 of his forces out of Princeton to do as ordered, go south and reinforce Cornwallis and Trenton. He still had no idea that Washington was still not located down at Trenton where everyone expected him to be. Thinking Washington was still down in Trenton, he was surprised to find a large body of forces moving up this river at the same time his force had just crossed the river. This meeting engagement quickly transitioned into a battle with General Hugh Mercer rushing forward with his men. Unaware of the size of the British force, Mercer was quickly overrun and bayoneted several times. Here in the battle before them, Cadwalader and Nicholas with the Continental Marines rushed forward to join the fight. Unfortunately, Mercer's men were in a full retreat and ran head-on into the Marines and the Associators as they were trying to form on the battlefield under enemy fire. The momentum of the retreat carried the Associators and Marines back approximately 150 yards before Cadwalader and Nicholas were able to regain control of their men. It was at that decisive moment that George Washington arrived on the scene and ordered a counterattack. The Marines and militia charged into the oncoming British, and turned the tide of battle. They were reinforced by Continentals closing in from both flanks. The British, causing Washington to shout out, "It's a fine fox chase, my boys," and personally ran down several British for several miles before his aides were actually able to rein him back in and say, "Hey, sir, we got to get back to the main fight." Sullivan continued the attack towards Princeton and chased the remnants of the British into Nassau Hall on Princeton University, which still exists today. That is a modern day photo, obviously, of Nassau Hall. Young Captain Alexander Hamilton, who is a battery commander from New York, fired his cannon right into the front door of Nassau Hall, supposedly decapitating a picture of King George that was hanging on the wall, before an infantry unit made entry and captured nearly 200 British that were held up in this building. In all, the British sustained 450 killed, captured, wounded, and missing. The Americans lost about 30 people in the battle. Among them, though, was Pennsylvania Marine William Shippen, as described earlier. Washington, Knox, and others really wanted to continue the attack at this point towards Brunswick, where Charles Lee, who had earlier been captured, was being held captive, and there were 70,000 pounds sterling war chests that the British had left there. Unfortunately, they recognized the fact that their soldiers and their Marines at this point had reached their culminating point. They had been on the move for 40 hours straight without any food, without any sleep, without any drink, and marched tens of miles through blizzards and fought 2 major battles. Washington wisely decided to move his force further north into the New Jersey highlands to a place called Morristown, from where he would keep a close eye on the remaining British in New Jersey during what became known as the Forage War. Nicholas and the Marines remained with the Army during what was this first protracted land campaign for Marines. They conducted guard duty, ran patrols, and executed raids until called upon once more to leverage their unique skill set. Because Henry Knox, who was the commander of the Continental Artillery, faced a conundrum. Due to disease, desertion, and casualties, and terminating enlistments, he now had far more cannon than he had men to man them. So as he looked about Morristown, he said, wait a minute now, those Marines come from ships where they also fire cannons. So he went to General Washington and he requested to have the Continental Marine Battalion assigned to the Continental Artillery Corps for the Army. And the Marines would fight in this regard during the Forage War for the next 4 months as the Continental Artillery. They didn't mind this very much, though, because artillerymen got a little bit extra pay. So the Marines continued on these duties in support of General Washington for the Army for approximately 4 more months. Captain Mullen, the owner of Tun Tavern, was the first to depart when his company was ordered to escort prisoners back to Philadelphia and report back to his ship, the Delaware. The others soon followed. As mentioned earlier, Captain Porter chose to remain with the Army as an artillery officer. He was joined by his friend, Captain Craig, who was Samuel Nicholas's adjutant at the time. Nicholas remained faithfully with his battalion till the end and then returned to Philadelphia, where he continued to serve as the senior Marine until the end of the war. He requested command of the Marine detachment on board America's first and only ship of the line, the 74-gun monster called the America that was built up in New Hampshire. It was completed in 1782, but the war ended before the ship could be put to sea and join the fight. And the United States actually gifted the America to the French for their support during the war. Nicholas returned to running the Conestoga Tavern back in Philadelphia on Market Street and remained active in community affairs until his death at the age of 46 in 1790. By war's end, 231 officers and approximately 2,000 enlisted men had served honorably as Continental Marines, with many more serving as state and soldier Marines. 49 Continental Marines gave their lives in the service of their country, and another 70 received wounds. They established a legacy that those of us in uniform, and many of you sitting in this audience today, strive to emulate today. The operations surrounding the 10 crucial day comprised the Marines' first sustained land campaign, but it would certainly not be their last. In every American conflict for the last 247 years, Marines have served critical roles, winning new laurels in peace and war, and their honorable service continues today. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Semper Fidelis. I look forward to your questions. What's on your minds? Yes, sir.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Just a quick question around uniforms. Did the Marines at this time have distinctive uniforms from the Army ones?
In fact, the answer is twofold. In one sense, no, because they didn't have any prescribed uniform when they were first established. So they came to war with whatever they had, they were wearing. There was some captured hussar uniforms, which are light cavalrymen that they did give to the Marines before they went down to New Providence. But those are very bright colored uniforms until before Trenton, when this became the prescribed uniform for the Marines, which was distinct and unique from the Army uniforms, with that forest green color that distinguishes Marines compared to the blue and the red buff that you see on many Continental regulars. Thanks, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Early on, when you were talking about the initial creation of the Marine Corps, you said something about the motivation having to do with some part of Eastern Canada trying to become the 14th colony. And then I wondered what happened with that.
Yes, so great question. Thank you. So the question was the people, the Committee of Safety from Passamaquoddy asked to join the North Americans in the fight against the British, and the hope was that they would become a 14th American colony. What happened? What happened was we never executed the operation because George Washington balked, said, I don't have the soldiers in order to form these 2 battalions of Marines that would have been assigned to conduct the attack to capture Halifax and bring Passamaquoddy in as part of the American colonies. Because of that, Halifax continued to be the principal Royal Navy base in the northeastern sector of North America, and Passamaquoddy did not join us. So unfortunate, but didn't happen. That answer your question, ma'am?
General, I have 2 questions, actually. I'm a little bit confused on the chain of command. Did Nicholas report to the Continental Congress? Did he report to the Washington? Who was his boss? And the second
Samuel Nicholas's boss?
Yes.
So this is a challenge even today, sir, right? So, and over time, the Army and the Navy both think they own Marines. Okay, so to be clear, the Marines were established at this as a distinct branch to work for the fleet. So Nicholas worked for Essex Hopkins, the Commodore in charge of the fleet, while deployed on ship and while in port. But the Continental Congress detached him from the Navy with his battalion and attached him to the Army and General Washington for the land campaign that they fought.
Okay.
And then once they went back to the ships, they detached from the Army and were reattached to the Navy.
Okay. Very good. And were Marines also on board ships like with John Paul Jones and other expeditions that they would have had? Was there always a complement of Marines on a naval ship?
Predominantly, yes, but not always. And particularly the large capital ships, always yes. The frigates, which was the United States made a conscious decision during the war that mid-sized frigates would be our capital ship. We didn't have the manpower, we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the money to be able to build ships of the line or men of war, which are carrying between 70 and 100 cannons plus. Our frigates carried between 24 and 36 cannons. And so those ships, our capital ships, would always have a Marine detachment on board, but some of the other sloops or schooners or brigs may not have. And that's when you often saw privateers or merchant vessels that would have soldiers or sailors performing marine functions. So it does get a little cloudy, and that's why I present Washington's Marines as being actually 4 groups of people that served as Marines, not just the traditional Continental Marine.
Thank you again for the presentation. Does who invented Marines? Were they already part of the British military force? Were they part of the French? Or how new is that concept when the Continentals developed?
I'm sorry, was the question who?
How new was the concept of Marines, men who can fight on land and sea? Was that a new idea at this time, or had that been in the European militaries for a long time?
Yes, so American Continental Marines were based off of the model of the British Royal Marines. And yes, so Marines actually go back all the way until ancient times. You know, the Romans used Marines, but the first, what is considered the first corps of modern day Marines was 1664 and formed in the Europe theater of war. And they were used, the British were very effective in using their Royal Marines for landing parties and supporting the army, similar to what you saw happen here.
In the earliest iteration of our Marines, how did the Navy view them? Did they see them as a hindrance, or did they see them as like with John Paul Jones and his famous Bonham Richard? You know, were they part of the boarding party? Did they play a significant role, or you know, how did the Navy and was there any cross training? You know, there's so many casualties in those fights. Did they ever assume any functions on deck?
Yes, that's a great question. So it's a tough question to answer because I think that's all relative to your position in the Navy. Okay, so even today, we are having debates inside the Department of the Navy between the Navy and the Marine Corps because the Navy does not want to build the number of amphibious ships that we need. And the Commandant's been very clear, and we actually had to mobilize the Congress to direct the Navy to build the number of amphibious ships that we need to prosecute operations today, because they're more interested in building aircraft carriers and submarines. Rightfully so. They have a mission they have to perform, and they're challenged with limited resources to be able to do it all. So that all started way back when we were first established. Marines, just like George Washington saw the Marines as being as suck on his resources, the same applies to the Navy. The more Marines you have, the less resources you have for sailors. But if you're in a battle, you sure want those Marines on your side, lobbing grenades from the high top ends and sniping and being a boarding party going across to the enemy ship, or prosecuting a naval campaign with limited raids ashore to be able to, example, take out a shore-based battery and a choke point in the navigation of a river so that you can freely get through that area. So it's a little bit of a love-hate relationship that existed that started 247 years ago and still exists today. But again, I think generally speaking, sailors and Marines get along very well. They're all part of the crew of the ship that work for that ship's captain while they're deployed, and leadership matters. So it's the tone and the climate that is established by the commanding officer of that ship and the senior Marine on that ship that will establish the type of relationship they're going to have.
I've heard the term horse Marines. So I've heard the term horse Marines off and on. Is there a definitive definition of what a horse Marine might have been?
Yes, sir. Yeah, so now we're jumping into the 20th century, and the horse Marines are commonly Marines that were occupied in China from 1927 to 1941. And it was principally the 4th Marine Brigade that was stationed in Peking and also Shanghai. And they had mounted Marines that rode Chinese ponies, and they were referred to as the horse Marines. And one of our most famous Marines, all the Marines out here, Chesty Puller, and many of our well-known World War II Marines served in China prior to World War II and served as horse Marines during the time as well. By the way, I commanded 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, known as the China Marines, who are some of the original horse Marines. I'm sorry? There you go. Chesty Puller, for those who don't know, is the most decorated Marine in Marine Corps history. He had 5 Navy Crosses and several other awards.
That was a great talk. I really appreciate it. I remember doing budgets. I have a question, but I remember doing budgets before for the Army before about the time of Goldwater Nichols, and I remember saying something like, "Aren't the Russians actually the enemy?" And people would be saying, "Yeah, but it's the Navy. It's after our money." But,
I'm sorry, sir.
I said, I would say, doing budgets, aren't the Russians actually the enemy? And people would be saying, well, yeah, but it's the Navy, it's after our appropriation.
Yes, well,
Let's not lose sight of what the real problem, but I wanted to ask you, it seemed like the Romans, you could see having, they were such a powerful land army. They developed a great Navy, but they were a land, their real power was land army. You can see that they would think about fighting men on ships would be obvious to them. Did the Greeks and the people, the triremes, and before that, did they also have fighting soldiers on ships?
and who are you asking about?
Greeks or the Persians or the other,
Absolutely, sir. Yes.
they must have. I mean,
Yeah, they absolutely did. And for example, the Spartans fought at sea. So they weren't necessarily referred to as Marines, but they were foot soldiers that would fight at sea. So for example, the Roman legions had probably the best known and best equipped and best ground force available at the time. And they had something called a corvus, which was, just think, a big plank board with a hook at the end of it. They would row next to the enemy ships and just drop that board and then run their soldiers across to the enemy ship and capture it, using the strength of their ground force in a naval campaign, changing the direction that they would operate. And it proved very successful.
The title of your book, Washington Marines, was first used in 1741 with the American Regiment at Cartagena. When Major McClellan wrote his initial history of the Marine Corps in the 30s, he tried to trace the Marine Corps back to the Marines under Gooch in Washington, so that he could say that George Washington was trained by a Marine. Did you look into that at all for your book?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
I said, did you look into McClellan's claim? He tried to push the Marine Corps birthday back there to 1741 with Lawrence Washington.
Yes, that has been discussed, but I would argue that we didn't have an official American Continental Marines until we had a Congress that could establish them. So back in 1741, we were still under British rule. So you could technically say they were American Marines fighting as part of the British forces, which did happen. And as I mentioned, we used the Royal Marines as the model for creating Continental Marines, which then transitioned to become United States Marines once the United States was established. But we're actually older than the country that we defend. Yes, absolutely, sir. Thank you.
General, thanks again for your presentation. I was particularly interested in your mention of state Marines. I don't recall reading too much. Of course, I've seen that mentioned in some history books, but I don't recall it being mentioned very often. And so my question is that or any other aspect of your research, do you consider it kind of groundbreaking, or did you discover more than you had previously seen published? And was it kind of anything in your book, that or anything else, a new contribution to the topic?
I wouldn't necessarily call my book groundbreaking. It's just, I think what I was able to do is take the work of several other great authors and consolidate it into one concise narrative for the topic at hand. So I think if you read a lot of the state histories, they'll certainly talk about the contribution of their state Marines. I think this may be just one of the first times that we brought that all into the umbrella of all of Washington's Marines. You're welcome. Sure.
Thank you for a great presentation. A more general question: what is the origin of the Marine Corps' anthem, "Shores of Tripoli, Halls of Montezuma," and also the slogan "Semper Fi"?
Did you ask where does Montezuma come from?
No, the Marine anthem, the origin of the Marine anthem.
Yes. So the Marines hymn didn't come out until 1868. And originally, when we talked about the halls of Montezuma, that was from the Mexican-American War. And to the shores of Tripoli was when a gentleman named Presley O'Bannon led 8 Marines and 400 Mameluke warriors 400 miles across the Libyan desert, excuse me, to attack Derna, Tripoli. And that's where that aspect from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli came
It
from.
was called the Barber War against North Africa.
Yes, during the Barbary Wars, exactly right.
Right, and the expression "Semper Fi," always faithful.
Yes. Yeah, late also in the 19th century. And some people still debate what the original origin of that was, but it was during the 19th century. And as you know, Latin for always faithful to God, country, and corps.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
How does it happen that we and the British use a French word for this corps, Marine?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand it.
Marine is definitely a French pronunciation. How does it happen that we and the British call them a French word?
I'm hearing the French and British.
The word Marine, the way it's pronounced, is French. Marine is French. How does it happen that we and the British use a French word for this service?
But I love French fries. I'll tell you that. No, obviously, you know, French was a universal language back in the day. And so there are many French words that were adopted in the English language that became common. I would assume maybe that's what happened, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to research that further. It's a great question, though.
All right, General, we do have a few questions
Okay.
from our attendees on Zoom. And 2 questions kind of complement each other very well. And we're going to jump forward, and I don't want you to give any spoilers from your current project that you told me about, but let's fast forward a little bit to later on in 1777. Where did the Marines play a significant role or an active role in the Delaware River naval defenses of Forts Mercer and Mifflin
Did they play a significant role in what?
in the naval defenses of the Delaware River, say
Yes.
with Forts Mercer and Mifflin?
Yes, absolutely. So there's, if you go to Philadelphia, there's a statue of a gentleman named John Berry, who is one of the Continental Navy captains. And John Berry was given overall command of the defense of the Delaware River. And the British sent 2 frigates up the river to test the defenses to see if they could capture Philadelphia, the capital of our new nation. And John Berry had Marines working for him on the Delaware River. And they only had a couple of small brigs. And then the most effective unit that they used against these large British frigates with 30 to 40 cannons on board were single gun gondolas that were on the river. And the nice thing about it was when you're in a river, it pays to be smaller and more maneuverable, because those big frigates could not maneuver effectively. And think of it being as though they were bees swarming around a house, and the frigate being the house, and the bees were just shooting shots and holing them and shooting down their rigger and causing severe damage on the ships, causing them to do some crazy maneuvering, which ran one of the HMS Roebuck, one of the frigates, aground until the tide raised and they were able to get her off. So they won that battle. They successfully defended the Delaware River and the capital, Philadelphia, with a very small force of Marines and sailors.
Great, thank you. And if we fast forward a little bit to the later part of the war, how about the Southern campaign? Were there Marines down in the Southern Department?
Yeah, so Andrew and I were talking earlier, and I'm actually working on a collaborative project right now with Dr. Charles Niemeyer, who is the former director of the Marine Corps History Division. And he is writing about Marines fighting on the Mississippi River during 1778. We fought all the way down from the Ohio down to New Orleans down the Mississippi River. And then I'm writing about the Penobscot expedition that occurred up in Maine. but there were not a lot of Marines fighting in the Southern campaign, particularly not with the Army, with Greene and Morgan and the others who did such a great job there on the ground. So limited in the South.
Great, thank you. And towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned the America, one of the only ships of the line of the U.S. Navy. We have one question from an attendee. We get that the French helped us out, but why on earth would we give our only ship of the line to the French when we needed it so much?
Because the war was over and it cost a lot of money to maintain. And we owed France a lot of money. There's a lot of debate about whether they were giving us loans or they giving us grants. Well, if you ask us, they were giving us grants. They will tell you they were giving us loans. So this was one way to appease the French, to show that, hey, we're serious about showing our thanks and appreciation for your support during the war. And this was gifted to them partially to compensate for what they have done for us.
Great, thank you. And in writing your book, where did you find the most abundant, I should say the best resources, the best primary source materials that you
Sure.
consulted?
So I'll tell you three principal areas. One, the University of Virginia has digitalized all of George Washington's write-ins and papers. And that is I actually wrote this book while stationed in Portugal, serving with NATO. And there's such a wealth of online references today. And that was a principal primary source to be able to read all of George Washington's papers. So that's one. Secondly, the Navy in the late 50s through the 60s created a 7-volume set of naval documents of the American Revolution. And it's everything from ship rosters to battle plans, and just a great source of primary reference material from the naval forces. And then the third one, there are several compilations of primary source data put into books that authors had put together. And one I found particularly helpful is called The Spirit of 76. And it goes through the American Revolution and all the key events that occurred. And then they bring in primary source documents and witness accounts from those events that I would use to as a starting point to then point me into other more specific and detailed references to hunt down. And that's part of the greatness of history, right? It's like a treasure hunt, getting out there and finding those key nuggets of information. But I think you start with some of those key references like that, and then they'll put you down different paths.
Great. And to dovetail into the next question here, and this might be a little bit of a softball, the Marines have a very rich history, obviously. What drew you to the American Revolution? Was it just to tell the story of the origins, or was there a particular fascination with that conflict?
Why I chose that?
Yeah, why? Yeah.
Because that's where it all began.
All right.
And quite frankly, if for those Marines in the room, we give a lot of homage, and it's particularly important that we teach our history and tradition, because knowing that that's part of our actual culture, it's part of the ethos of who we are, and that becomes a force multiplier on the battlefield. We will not allow those Marines who went before us and sacrificed before us down. We will live up to the legacy that they established. That's what we instill in our Marines. We won't fail. We succeed in everything we do. We owe it to those Marines from 1775 to do that for them. And so I'm a lover of history, but what I recognize is a lot of Marines don't know this part of our story. They know about Iwo Jima, the picture I showed at the beginning. They know about World War II and Fallujah and Desert Storm, but they don't go as far back. They know about Trenton. They know about Samuel Nicholas and Tun Tavern, of course, but they don't know the rest of the story. So this was my opportunity to be able to share the rest of the story, not only with Marines, but with Americans across the board.
Well, it's music to our ears here at the ARI. So thank you very much. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. General Baum, I want to thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Thank you all for coming out, and in person and on Zoom. And we will see you next time. Get home safe, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, folks. I really enjoyed that.